whose music was so strange that orchestras refused to perform it. But today, he's considered one of the greatest musical innovators. Well, I want to tell you about an American composer by the name of Charles Ives. Charles was born in Danbury, Connecticut in 1874. His father was a Civil War bandmaster and very influential in his musical life. His father, George, believed that music should be experimented with, not just simply memorized, but played around with, and Charles took this on. Charles was taking lessons from his father, and he learned piano, he learned organ and composition, but now his way of learning and his father's way of teaching was a little unconventional. For example, he would have to sing a tune in one key and then play piano in a different key at the same time. Or they would be out, and his dad wanted him to really listen to two different bands playing two different songs at the same time and where they overlapped and where they didn't. His father really wanted him to explore dissonance and strange rhythms and just keep trying new things, and he did. George Ives taught his son Charles that rules in music were not laws, they were just tools to be followed. He did not like the orderly music and said it doesn't always need to be orderly. So all these composers in America that were really going the European style or the more pleasant style, that's not what Charles was doing. He was like listening, what does American life sound like? And started really loving the idea of chaos and just a truth in music, what he thought was a truth in music. After high school, he went to Yale and studied composition. Now, his teacher was a German-trained composer, very traditional, and there was a lot of clash. So after a while, Charles Ives realized, now for my assignments, I'm going to do exactly as I'm taught. And he was learning, right? He was learning about harmonization and a whole bunch of other things. But then in his own time, he would write things that were very clashing and unsettling and unkind. And then he graduated. And now he had to figure out, am I going to be a composer and a musician and have a hard life, which is not always a hard life, or am I going to do something that is a financial stability? Well, here his life is different than many composers. So he starts working in insurance and actually founds a firm, an insurance firm. But it's not instead of music. It's also on top of music. This way, he did not have to rely on his music to sell. To make a living, so he could continue to be experimental and do whatever he wanted because his insurance company was making an income. Many people now know him as a composer, but actually during his lifetime, he was far more successful as a business plan and quite an innovator. And he actually came up with the concept of estate planning and was known for that, but he was composing all the same. At the time, people said that his innovations musically were absolutely bizarre and crazy, but now we see that he was way ahead of his time. So he is performing and composing at the turn of the century, so late 19th century, early 1900s. One of the things he does is polytonality, which is that where you're playing different lines in different keys at the same time. And this can sound very clashy, doesn't have to, but it often does. Also, polyrhythm, where you have conflicting rhythms that just kind of feel syncopated or maybe not even, right? And he was doing all this way before this was the norm, because modernism is not a thing yet. So created musical collages, which is where you put things on top of each other that don't normally go together. So like a march and a hymn and maybe some folk music. And so there's 3 different genres and 3 different feelings, and he would layer them on top of each other. People listening to it at the time said, this is chaotic. This music sounds horrible and chaotic. But to Charles Ives, he said, no, this sounds honest. One of his most well-known pieces is called The Unanswered Question. This is something that's easier to play, and it really captures his philosophical approach to music. So you have it in 3 different layers. So you have the strings on the bottom, and they're playing slow, quiet, tonal music, and it represents silence and eternity. Then they have a solo trumpet that repeatedly asks a short, mysterious phrase, and it's like the question of existence. And then you have the woodwinds, and they're attempting these frantic answers, becoming more and more dissonant and more chaotic. And eventually these woodwinds just give up, and the trumpet asks a question one last time. And then there is no answer. He was using music truly philosophically, a way to deal with questions. Why are we here? What is our purpose? And also to reflect like a mirror the chaos that he saw both in the real world, like physically, but also in people's minds. During his lifetime, it was incredibly difficult for him to find musicians that would perform his music. People didn't understand it, so it was complicated. And also they hated it. Not everybody, right? But overwhelming. People were like, this is not music. Good job, boy. And they thought of him more as like a businessman who was dabbling in music instead of this guy who has like a great degree in composition and really understands music very well. They just did not understand it. And so his music kind of went unplayed for decades. 1920s, he's really struggling with his health, possibly linked to stress and diabetes, so he kind of stops composing altogether. And at this point, he does continue to revise his older works. Later on, he refuses to go to any performances of his own works because he says what he hears other musicians play is not what he heard in his head when he was writing it down. Thank goodness he lived long enough to see a slow rediscovery of his music. So in the 1930s, definitely the 40s, some of the performances of his music increased and people were slowly starting to shift on what they thought music should and should not be. And then in 1954, he passed away. Charles Ives himself said that music should be a transcendental language and not just sound. He was a pioneer in modernism, definitely way ahead of his time. Some people love his music, some people hate his music, but go and listen to some Charles Ives.